digamos que estamos en nuestra segunda parte del taller del día de hoy. Creo que ha sido una sesión de taller inicial muy rica, muy importante. Y bueno, ahora continuamos con la conferencia magistral. Yo quiero agradecerte, Mala, la doctora Mala Htun, el haber aceptado estar aquí con nosotros en este espacio que estamos construyendo, ¿no? Para a su vez ir construyendo nuestra propia cultura de género. Entonces, pues te agradecemos de todo corazón, estés aquí con nosotros, y también le agradezco mucho a Gisela el haberte invitado. E igualmente quiero agradecer a la maestra Valeria Basúa Valenti, que nos va a acompañar con la traducción simultánea. Entonces, sin más, pues bienvenidas a ambas y te dejo la palabra, Gisela.
Sí, voy a presentar a Mala Htun brevemente y luego pasaré la palabra a Mala. Mala, I will do a brief presentation of you. Okay. Mala es profesora en ciencias políticas en la Universidad of New Mexico. Es investigadora principal y coordinadora de la iniciativa Advance, también en esta Universidad of New Mexico. Es fundadora del programa para promover el acceso de mujeres en el programa de Minority and STEAM Faculty, y es asesora especial para la inclusión y el clima, ¿no? en UNM School of Engineering. Y bueno, y trabaja los temas de género, equidad, derechos de las mujeres, raza y etnicidad, de política latinoamericana y diversidad e inclusión en la academia. Pueden consultar su página, y voy a mencionar 3 últimos libros que ha publicado: el libro Sex and the State, Abortion, Divorce, and the Family Under Latin American Dictatorships. Inclusion, otro libro, Inclusion Without Representation in Latin America, y el último libro, una de las más sólidas investigaciones a nivel mundial, sobre The Logics of Gender Justice, State Action and Women's Rights Around the World. Mala, te cedo la palabra. Vamos a co-coordinar la mesa con Raúl-Pacheco Vega, y si necesitan interpretación, solo le tienen que dar clic en el menú de abajo al simbolito de mundo que dice Interpretation. Mala va a hablar en inglés y después va a contestar las preguntas y respuestas. Esa parte la va a guiar Raúl-Pacheco Vega. La parte de preguntas y respuestas las va a contestar en español. Ok, thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a todos y todas. Estoy muy feliz por la invitación de estar aquí, y pido disculpas que voy a dar la presentación en inglés, pues escribí este artículo en inglés y todavía no he tenido la oportunidad de traducir los conceptos y las frases claves al español, pero voy a hablar despacio y hasta que pueda también puedo ayudar con la traducción si hay algunas dudas. Pero entonces muchas gracias y bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todos. Voy a share my screen. A ver. Okay. Yeah. Bien. This article has been published. I'm going to speak about a collaborative work with Francesca Jensenius from the University of Oslo in Norway. This article, or most of it, has now been published in World Politics earlier this year, and I'm happy to share it. We start from the premise of the global rights revolution for women, which I refer to as a series of massive legal changes that have occurred in most countries of the world since the 1960s and 1970s. Legal changes advancing women's rights in family law, in reproductive choice, in rights to maternity and parental leave, in childcare, in equality in the workplace, provisions for equal pay, equal opportunities for promotion. Most of my work for the first 20 years of my career was studying why these changes occurred and developing theories about the conditions of equal rights reform and variation in equal rights reform. Gisela mentioned my 2018 book with Laurel Weldon. But whenever I presented these works, I would always get the so what question. People would ask me, okay, so we see these great legal changes on the books in legal statutes. Have they made any difference? Have legal reforms advancing women's rights produced any changes in public behavior and public attitudes? And indeed, there's a lot less research on the effects of new legislation than there is on the causes and conditions of new legislation. So my current book project with Francesca Jensenius is called Enacting Equality. And in this book project, we're looking at the effects of equal rights legislation on society. And today I'm going to present to you the one part of this book, which is on the effects of violence against women legislation. And so we're going to be asking in this project, have legal changes on violence against women been associated with social changes? And what are the mechanisms? So if there are changes, what are the mechanisms that connect these legal changes with changes in behavior and attitudes? So just as a little bit of background, these two panels are from a paper that we published in the journal Daedalus in 2020. These data are from the World Bank, from the World Bank's Women, Business, and the Law data set. And the top panel shows you, looking across about 180 countries, you can see in the lighter shades, countries that have some legislation or legal penalties relating to intimate partner violence or domestic violence. The countries that are shaded dark, so Russia, some countries of Central Africa, Afghanistan, and so forth, are countries that have no legislation. But the vast majority of countries have responded to global feminist networks and domestic feminists demanding state action on violence by enacting some form of national law. Now, the bottom panel shows you that these laws recognize distinct forms of violence. So not just physical violence or even not just psychological violence, but also sexual violence and increasingly economic violence. So seizing a woman's property, denying her access to the home, preventing her from working. 66% of laws on the books also recognize or typify economic violence. So this is just to show you there's a lot of state action. But as we know, it's one thing to have laws on the books and another thing to actually implement and enforce these laws, especially throughout the global South, where there are many new rights, but not always implementation and enforcement of these rights. And in fact, there are reasons to think that especially in the area of violence, there's a big gap between beautiful, lovely laws and the situation on the ground. So I see the chat blowing up, but because I'm sharing my screen, I can't see anything in the chat. So somebody needs to talk to me if I'm speaking too quickly or if I need to help with a translation. Jackie True, who's a scholar of gender violence, has said that violence is becoming more common and more egregious across the world. And we know that lockdowns for the COVID pandemic, economic crisis, civil conflict, civil wars, all of these factors increase risk factors for violence. So they increase those conditions and those circumstances that make individuals more likely to commit acts of violence and to suffer violence. It's also the case that the empowerment of women may trigger a backlash form of violence. So if women's status is increasing relative to men in their lives, men may feel insecure, and that may cause them to lash out and perpetrate more violence. So because of the exacerbation of risk factors for violence, alongside the proliferation of laws intended to combat violence, many people suspect that laws on violence, laws intended to combat, to prevent, to punish violence, are weak institutions and a form of window dressing intended to look good abroad, look good to the international community, look good to foreign donors, but effectively do nothing. So there's a very skeptical sense in much of the literature and in much of the feminist community about the existence of these enduring gaps between law and practice. Today, however, I'm going to present data for a more cautiously optimistic assessment of current trends on violence. I'm going to present data showing that at least intimate partner violence, which is the most common form of violence that women suffer, has declined in one of the world's more violent societies, in Mexico. And I'm going to present data showing that public attitudes have shifted and that more women are willing to report violence they experience to authorities and to speak about it to family and friends. So as all of you know, there's been a lot of activism in the streets and social media, protesting a seeming rise in femicides and other horrific episodes of violence. And women's protests, national women's strikes have generated the impression that violence is increasing. And there hasn't been much of a differentiated or disaggregated look at what forms of violence are increasing and what forms of violence may actually be declining. And I'm going to present data that goes against the conventional wisdom generated by media coverage of these protests and show that actually for a very common form of violence, things are getting better, not worse. Okay, so let me give you the theoretical basis of our project. So I mentioned earlier that Francesca and I are writing a book called Enacting Equality. And in part of that book, we're developing theories about how the law affects society. And we're not developing like originally, but we're trying to modify a theory about the expressive power of the law. And this is a less popular or less common theory about how the law affects society than classical approaches. So the classic view is that systems of rule, of which the law is part, so the law makes up part of a state's system of rule, works through deterrence. So the law controls people and the law affects behavior because people obey because they're afraid of costs of not obeying. So if you don't obey the law, you could go to prison. You could suffer a punishment worse than prison, or you could incur a fine. So fear of suffering that kind of penalty is what obliges people to follow the law. But there's another way that the law shapes behavior, which Max Weber pointed out, over 100 years ago. Weber's key insight was that systems of surveillance and punishment are inefficient, that it's very costly to observe and monitor and punish everybody who breaks the law. It's much easier if people voluntarily comply. And people are likely to comply voluntarily with the law if they believe that it is legitimate. So Weber said that systems of rule have different ways that they cultivate legitimacy, that they cultivate, in other words, a belief among citizens that complying with the law is the right thing to do. We call this bottom-up compliance, that people just follow the law because they want to. And so our approach is that laws can affect people not just by making them afraid, but by generating a sense or changing people's sense of what the right thing to do is. And laws do this by sharing information about norms. And by norms, we refer to widely held standards of desirable and appropriate conduct. So even when the law is silent or doesn't say anything, our lives are still governed by social norms, which may not be codified, that tell us how to behave in certain situations. Laws can sometimes shape norms just by making it obvious what the norms are, by sending a message or telling a story about how people should behave. The idea behind a law and economics scholar named Richard McAdams, who's at the University of Chicago, he has developed what he calls an esteem theory, which is a theory of why people comply with norms and comply with the law. And he says that people want to conform, meaning adapt or align their behavior with what they perceive norms to be, in order to gain and retain social status and to avoid losing social status. So the example that I always give is people walking their dogs in the neighborhood. And the norm is that if your dog goes poop on the sidewalk or on the street or on somebody else's lawn, you need to pick it up. And if you don't, and somebody sees you just leaving it there, you will lose esteem in the neighborhood. People will think you're a bad person. People will think you're not a good neighbor. People might be less inclined to invite you to a neighborhood party. They might be less inclined to watch your house when you're out of town. So there's a certain social status or sense of esteem that goes with complying to dominant social norms. And so this is a softer mechanism through which the law shapes behavior. And feminist scholars such as Catherine McKinnon have also pointed out and agreed with this approach to the law. And she writes, you can see in the quote on the page, that the real point of law is not incarceration or damage awards, that is the command and control and deterrence versions, but voluntary compliance, otherwise known as legal socialization or education. And so what we're going to be arguing here is that laws on violence against women have this expressive power. They send a message and they tell a story about what types of behavior are socially acceptable and not socially acceptable. We're not saying that this is the only thing that laws combating violence do. They also create protective mechanisms for victims, restraining orders. They punish offenders, they set penalties, they try to coordinate administrative responses across prosecutors' offices, across social services, healthcare, police, and so forth. But a big component is related to changing norms. Now, what are these norms? So there is a belief that violence is an individual phenomenon, that people who are exposed to aggression, to abuse themselves, people who are under the influence of alcohol are more likely to commit violence. But one major contribution of the feminist movement has been to convince us that violence against women is a function of women's cultural subordination, that is, of a low social status because of cultural values and meanings and practices. So it's not just an abusive individual who is responsible for violence, but it is a cultural and social context of inequality that fosters violence, that makes violence acceptable. And indeed, with fancy survey research across the world, many scholars have found a strong association, even at the subnational level, between the strength of attitudes condoning or supporting or excusing violence and women's actual experiences of violence. So there's a lot of empirical evidence that cultural contexts that legitimize violence also make violence more likely to happen. Now, it took until the second generation of violence against women legislation for this normative and systemic, cultural or systemic aspect of violence to become more explicit in legislation. So let me just move on here to my next slide. So in the first generation of violence against women legislation, such as in the early 1980s in Mexico, in the 80s in the United States, so in Mexico, one of the first achievements was to recognize marital rape as a crime. In the US, there was a lot of action around increasing penalties for violence as part of the expansion of our crime bill and the carceral state in the 1990s. But the second generation violence against women laws, driven by feminist activism, both nationally and transnationally, as well as alliances between politicians in Congress, feminists and political parties, and non-governmental organizations, was to show that these different forms of violence are linked. So rape, sexual violence, stalking, intimate partner violence, feminicidio, sexual harassment, these are all part of an underlying phenomenon we call violence against women, and they're all related to gender subordination culturally. So this was a big ideological achievement, as it were. Now, in Mexico, the 2007 Ley General de Acceso a una Vida Libre de Violencia is the embodiment of this second generation approach. And as you may know, this is not just a federal law, but it required that all states emulate this law by enacting similar bodies of legislation within, I believe it was a 1 to 2 year time period. Okay, so this 2007 law and the package of state laws embodied this more normative approach by recognizing many different types of violence and recognizing that violence against women is linked to cultural subordination and social norms. It's not just an act of individual aggression. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're trying to assess the effects on society of these new laws. Now, this is not a controlled experiment where we are able to isolate the independent effect of the law compared to a bunch of other factors. Okay, this is not a controlled experiment. This is real world, messy, empirical data. So we're acknowledging that because we're looking at real world observational data, not experimental data, that we're not measuring and assessing the effects of the law on its own, but we're studying what we call a bundle of legal change, feminist activism, and media coverage. So in reality, activism drove the enactment of these progressive laws. And then activism made these progressive laws known to society. So you had social activism, civic activism, feminist movement activism on the front side and on the back side, assisted by a lot of media coverage of scandalous episodes of violence. So this is in reality how things happen. So in reality, it's very hard to just measure the effect of the law without measuring the effect of the activism that went into enacting the law and then making the law known. So we're calling this a bundle. And for more details, you can read the paper where we talk about this quite explicitly. All right, so that's the theory. What kind of data are we presenting? So we are looking at a fabulous survey that INEGI has run since 2003. And they've done it 4 times. So these 4 waves of the Endire survey, 2003, 2006, 2011, and 2016, have sampled households across the entire country. There are representative samples in all 32 states. And you can see the number of people who were interviewed in these households. The survey enumerators, that is, people went door to people's houses and interviewed women aged 15 and older and asked them a very long series of personal questions about their work, their personal lives, experiences in their family, their living conditions, their experiences in school, on the street. And the main focus was violence and discrimination. The survey instruments changed a bit. So in the most recent one, there were questions about violencia obstétrica that you didn't have in the earlier ones. So they're not all the same, but the idea is to get a sense of what types of violence forms women are experiencing in different spheres, from public institutions to school to work to the home. To make this data analysis comparable across all survey waves, we just focus on women in a relationship, currently in a relationship. So either, a de facto partnership or a marriage, okay? But women in a relationship. So one of our contributions is to operationalize the idea of norm change. So in other words, how do you know if social norms have changed? And so we spell out the observable implications of Richard McAdams's 3 conditions for the emergence of a new norm. So in his theoretical work about laws and norms, he says that we know that there's a new norm if, one, there is a growing societal consensus that a certain behavior is unacceptable, in our case, violence. So a growing consensus among people in society that this behavior is unacceptable, that it's worthy of losing esteem. The second condition is a greater risk that violations of this consensus will be detected. So if, it's not okay to just leave dog poop on the sidewalk, but nobody's ever going to see me because they're at work all the time, then there's no detection risk. So I could violate the norm with impunity and nobody would ever know. So that's why it's really important that there is a risk that violations of the norm can be detected. And then the common knowledge condition, number 3, is more widespread awareness of this consensus, number 1, and of the detection risk, number 2. So what are the observable, what would this look like in the data? This is the hardest part of all social science. Like what would, if this theory is correct, what would this look like in the data, especially data that we didn't gather ourselves and data that are not fabricated through a controlled experiment, right? So we're saying that what this looks like in the data, first of all, is 1, we're going to see a change in behavior, a decline in rates of domestic abuse. Of course, this decline could be through many other reasons, not just a change in norms. So there are 2 more. 2 is a decline in attitudes conducive to domestic abuse. Number 3, a rise in the violation or detection risk, which is more women are reporting violence to authorities or telling family and friends about it. Okay, so number 3 means that the detection risk of violating the norm has increased because women are reporting. And then 4 is we're operationalizing this as greater knowledge of the law, which lays out a framework to report and also clearly says that this behavior is a violation of human rights, it's unacceptable, and so forth. All right, so let's look at the first observable implication. Is there a decline in rates of domestic abuse? Now, we are looking at questions that are the same across all surveys. And so I'll show you in a second the 28 items, but these 28 items are physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence in the intimate partner context. Now, many studies look at the lifetime prevalence of violence. So have you ever experienced being hit, or have you ever experienced somebody threatening to kill you? We're not looking at the lifetime prevalence. We are looking at experiences in the previous 12 months, because that is something that could change. So in the previous 12 months, has anybody shot at you? You'll see the questions in a second. And we're focusing, remember, on women only living currently with a partner. So here are some examples. Le ha hecho sentir miedo. La ha vigilado o espiado. Amenazado con algún arma. Le ha amenazado con matarla, matarse él o matar a los niños. Amarrado, pateado, golpeado, disparado con un arma, exigido tener relaciones sexuales. So here are some of the 28 questions. And so you can see that this survey is actually quite involved. There are many very personal questions. So here we have, and this is overall the whole national sample. This is the share of women who say they had experienced any of these forms of abuse in the previous 12 months. In 2003, almost 41% of women said they had experienced one of these forms of abuse in the previous 12 months. And this declines steadily until it's about 27% in 2016. So that's a highly significant decline. About 1.5 million fewer women between surveys are saying they experienced one of these forms of abuse in the previous 12 months. And this decline, we can see it across all states. In fact, more sharply in some of the states that had higher rates of violence in 2003. But these maps, the red shows you, the red is where a greater than 50% of women say they experienced this form of abuse. And then you can see that it's going down to light yellow in a significant number, or darker yellow in a significant number of places by 2016. So this is a national thing. What about attitudes? So if you ask these are from 2011, and you can see that in 2011, only about 2% of women say or agree with the statement that a man has the right to hit his wife. But a larger share agree with statements that uphold or make it more excusable for violence to occur, such as a wife should obey her partner, 23% agree. A woman is obliged to have sex with her partner, 19% agree. Violence is a family matter and should stay in the family, meaning don't talk about it ever with healthcare professionals or the police. 27% agree with that. So that seems like a lot. But if you look compared to 2003, in 2003, almost 10% of people agreed that a man has the right to hit his wife, and this declined to 2%. In 2003, 56% of people said that a wife should obey her partner. And by 2011, this had declined to 23%. So basically half the share of people in 2011 versus 2003 said that a wife should obey her partner. So there is far less agreement with attitudes that are conducive to abuse. So we interpret this as a sign of a growing societal consensus against abuse. So you may say, well, attitudes toward gender equality are changing everywhere. Is this really because of activism and laws against violence? So we did what we call a placebo test. And we thought, okay, well, if this hypothesis that attitudes are just changing in all respects is true, we would expect that fewer people would agree with the statement that a man should be in charge of all the costs in the family. And in terms of agreement with this statement, you can see that between 2003 and 2011, 65% of people agree that a man should be in charge, and there isn't much change. So we interpret this to be showing that attitudes toward violence are changing more quickly than attitudes toward other areas of gender relations. All right, what about condition 3, the detection risk? So reporting violence is very costly. There's a lot of literature on the reluctance and the cost-benefit calculations of victims of survivors of violence, that it's costly to report. It may lead to retaliation, to ostracism, to further violence. Nothing usually happens. So reporting is risky and it's very rare. But we do see in our data that the share of women who say, so this is actually just women experiencing physical domestic abuse. That's all the survey asked about. Women experiencing physical domestic abuse who say they reported it to any public authority went up from about 6.5% to 8% in this 2003 to 2011 period, okay? So it's inching up a bit. There is a greater growth in the share of women who said that they spoke to relatives or friends about abuse. So this is the share of women who had experienced physical abuse in the previous year who talked to family. On the left panel, this grew from 33% to about 42%. Or friends, this grew from about 10% to 15%. So there is a steady growth in the share of women who were willing to increase the detection risk by telling family and friends about the violence they had experienced. We also see that there is a change in the reasons women give for not reporting. And the survey asks people can give multiple reasons, but they ask people, if you didn't report, why? And I just want to call attention to this, this fifth from the left. Women could say no importante. So I didn't report because it wasn't important. And the share of women who say they didn't report because it wasn't important declines. That said, on the far left of the panel, you see that fear is a growing reason that women are giving for not reporting. Okay, the final condition, knowledge of the law. So we find that the common knowledge condition, knowledge of the law, is also quite pervasive. Now, there is some variation. Women in rural areas, women who are speakers of indigenous language, women with lower education are less likely to know about the general violence law. But there is fairly widespread knowledge, 84%. We also find that knowledge of the law is negatively associated with experiences of abuse and positively associated with, negatively associated with attitudes conducive to abuse, and positively associated with reporting rates. All right, so just to summarize, the data that I have presented show a decline in experiences of intimate partner violence, a decline in attitudes conducive to violence, a slight rise in reporting rates, and widespread knowledge of the law. And these trends are all consistent with the growing strength of norms condemning violence that we think is likely to be the effect of this bundle of legal change and feminist activism and media coverage. Now, as with most social science, we have to consider alternative explanations for these data trends. One popular alternative explanation is economic development, economic growth. Now, when we look across 32 states, we don't see an association between economic growth rates and reporting or attitudes of violence. What about overall societal violence? So when we look at the murder rate in states, because a lot of people think that, you know, that there's a relationship between overall violence in society and the violence that women suffer in an intimate context. We don't find a relationship between the murder rate and intimate partner violence, but yes, there is one between feminicidios and the murder rate. What about a time trend or generational change? in the appendix to our paper, we present lots of tables showing that these trends in experiences and attitudes are occurring within all age groups. Okay, so it's not just that younger people are replacing that younger people have more progressive attitudes and less experiences of violence, and they're replacing their older cohorts. In fact, we're seeing changes within all age groups. Finally, could it be the case that the law is just getting applied better by state actors, that greater enforcement is responsible for these changes and not the expressive power? So we looked at some of the studies giving each state an implementation score, and I'll show those tables in a second. But generally, we're finding that variation in the implementation score, so how much states are complying with their own laws, is related to reporting, but not with experiences. So let me just show. So here is, states could get like from a 10 to a 50 score on how well they are implementing violence laws. And we don't see a relationship here between a reduction in experiences of abuse and the implementation. But we do see that in states with higher implementation scores, that there is more reporting. And so it shows you that reporting of violence is really a function of the supportive infrastructure. So policies and agencies that reduce the risks of reporting and make it easier to report and seek help. Okay, so just to wrap up now, I am finishing. We want to convey a note of optimism in these challenging times, that there is a real impact on society of the decades of activism that feminists and civic movements and human rights movements have devoted to combating violence, that there are measurable changes in experiences and attitudes toward violence as a result of these efforts. We want to also convey optimism that even when laws are weakly enforced and when the resources devoted to implementing them are not as generous as we would like, that there could still be an effect on society through this mechanism of expressive power. We want, though, to also end with a cautious note that these conclusions about expressive power may not apply to all types of women's rights issues. So some areas may be more stubborn. There are different patterns associated with the law practice gap across issues. Some areas, for example, like parental leave, may require more resources than expressive power. Some areas may require more deterrent force. So we expect, as I've said for a long time, and I firmly believe that women's rights issues and gender equality issues are many issues and not just a single issue. So thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. And I am here to answer questions now. I'm going to stop share.
Pasamos ahora a Raúl.
Sí. Nada más, no sé si quieren que haga los comentarios en español
Ya, está bien, español está bien.
Me gustó mucho este trabajo, es muy en la línea de, digamos, todo lo que es difusión de políticas públicas, transferencia de políticas y demás. Yo nada más quisiera mencionar que, como tú lo dijiste, Mala, es complicado separar, ¿no? Realmente el efecto. Y sobre todo, creo que aquí el gran problema va a ser, digamos, la capacidad del Estado para responder, ¿sí? Entonces, de hecho, lo comentan aquí en algunas preguntas en el chat. Pregunta Cecilia Gallet, que si al comparar personas en pareja al momento de la encuesta, ¿cómo controlas el hecho de que quienes viven formas más severas de violencia se separan cada vez más de sus parejas? Esas personas estarían separadas al momento de la escuela y podría sesgar los resultados. Esa es una pregunta. Un comentario.
Perdón, al momento de la encuesta.
Y al momento de la encuesta, sí. Entonces, eso no sesga los resultados.
Okay. So the question is, people who are experiencing very severe violence may have exited from their partnership and therefore would not be, they would not be counted as somebody currently. So, so for example, in 2003, we could have somebody who is suffering violence and they're counted because they're still living there, whereas in 2016, they have left, and so they're not counted as part of the same, okay.
Yes.
Right. So we don't have the ability to match people across. There are various reasons why we didn't do matching, but we still think that, so first of all, I think it's important for us not to overestimate the ease of exiting, right? We know that many people who experience severe violence are too economically vulnerable or socially afraid to leave their partners, even if they're suffering severe violence. So I think that exit is not always an option. I think that this is possible, and we've talked about this before, but people who would be exiting, I still think it's trivial. I'll need to think about this a little bit more and discuss it with Francesca. I don't think that this is going to be affecting our previous 12 months that much, but I think that if we had some kind of estimate, a quantitative estimate to give to you, that would help answer the question better. Okay.
Perfect. So
can I say one more thing about the capacidad del Estado de responder?
Sure.
Sometimes the state overdoes it. So in the US, there's a debate about using the criminal justice system to respond to intimate partner violence. And there are findings that abused women often end up worse when the state uses, so Bourdieu has sort of the right hand of the state is the carceral state and punishment and police, and the left hand is social services. When the state uses its right hand to deal with violence, women can end up worse. Women can also end up arrested. If they're arrested, the police arrest both partners, women are more likely to remain in jail. So they're very interesting studies about the state response, sometimes at least its right hand being too exaggerated. And there are many serious people who say that there needs to be more prevention and exit and escape, and just don't even have the cops involved. Now that's very controversial, but there is a reasonable debate going on about the type of response that is actually most effective, regardless of the capacity. But sometimes what I'm saying is police and carceral capacity, a lack of it, may not always be a bad thing, because sometimes they make it worse.
Which connects with Gloria del Castillo's question, right? On what kind of policies and programs have been implemented to accompany changes in rules where there are significant changes, like, you know, obedience to partners. So the reason why I ask is because I have the feeling that this particular administration is not providing financing to this program. So, you know, it ends up, there's this debate between the state, should the state or should the state not contribute to intimate partner violence solution. I'd like to make two more points just so that we can get all the questions out. Rodolfo Casillas comments that sometimes laws that are passed are because there's someone who cares about, you know, that law being passed. So that might also be one way, the explanation on you know, on the lobbying and so on. And Geraldine, who says, you know, laws also produce symbolic imaginaries in society, but, you know, is it necessary to have a law against violence against women that is accompanied by a very strong media coverage, and so that there's this change in norms actually occurs? I think those are great questions, and I would stop right there.
I think the question is, how do people know about the law? Like, I'm not sure if you guys have seen this law, but let me show it to you. And this is just the federal law. This isn't even the state law, but I'm going to share, because I think this is not just a silly exercise. This is helpful, but I just want us to look at it. Let me just, okay. So there's not just the law, but there's also the reglamentación. So this is, I'm going to share now. Like, so I even have this at 25 pages, right? Like, how, you know, most people are not going to know or even aware of this without a translation into their daily milieu, right? This is going to be published in the Gazeta Oficial or whatever you call it, and you know, it's very strong, right? It's a very strong law. It says all the progressive things in it, but without media coverage, without activism to actually translate the law, or people use the term vernacularize. Also because the law contains fancy concepts, but to vernacularize the law to people's everyday discourse, it's not going to matter much. I mean, that's what I think. And so I do think that this bundle is absolutely critical to make this very formal statutory document relevant in people's lives, in whatever way. So I don't think that the law can have any bearing if it's not through enforcement, right? The cop showing up and telling you, well, this is what the law says. Like, you know, you were speeding, you're not allowed to pass in this zone. You're not going to know. But I think that especially for an expressive law, nobody's going to know, because especially if it's not being enforced, nobody's going to know unless you have this necessary. So I think it is necessary. The societal activism and the media are necessary to make this law known.
Gisela, no sé si quieres que tomemos, Rodolfo menciona...
Sigue por ahí las preguntas y luego darle la palabra a Rodolfo.
Sí. Creo que las preguntas ya la había hecho él.
Una vez la palabra, sí. No
Sí,
sé, estamos igual en tiempo.
Sí. Rodolfo.
Gracias, Mala. Gracias, colegas. Bueno, una de las legisladoras que propuso esta ley de 2007 se llama Marisela Contreras, que fue una colaboradora de Flacso, fue mi asistente de investigación en particular, y la semana pasada, en que se hizo una presentación en este ciclo, se hizo referencia a esa ley. Y hubo una parte de la ponencia que a mí me generó dudas, y yo hablé con Marisela ese mismo día, ¿no?, para que me platicara cómo se gestó esa ley de 2007. ¿no? Entonces les quiero compartir eso, que también se suma a lo que yo hice también por ese año de 2007 como, digamos, un invitado técnico para la ley sobre trata de personas en México. Me tocó también trabajar con el Congreso Federal para esa ley del 2007. Y en síntesis, ratificaría el hecho de que esos elementos sociales, estadísticos, académicos, son algunos de los elementos que se toman en cuenta en la formulación de una ley, pero tiene una gran importancia la capacidad de gestión política de la fuerza política que quiere, o la fuerza partidaria en el Parlamento, en el legislativo, la capacidad que tiene para convencer y para hacer concesiones a las otras fuerzas políticas, ¿no?, para que firmen una ley determinada. Entonces, la ley tiene un componente importante, no de conocimiento, no de compromiso social, sino de capacidad de gestión en el legislativo, y eso fue lo que ocurrió en esas dos leyes de 2007, tanto en trata de personas como en esta Mala que tú nos has comentado con cierta amplitud. Y ese era un poco lo que yo quería incorporar, porque ciertamente en el caso del feminismo en México se tiene una gran tradición, una gran fuerza, pero en el caso de la trata de personas no teníamos esos antecedentes académicos, sociales, de organizaciones combativas en la materia, y que fueron otras razones más de carácter político lo que permitió esa ley, lo que no ocurrió con la ley en contra de las violencias de mujeres, a pesar de que las dos de alguna manera hacen referencia a una violencia de género. Perdón si me extendí en mi participación, simplemente quise ampliar la complejidad de que hay y de la relatividad de los elementos sociales, políticos y organizativos en la formulación o modificación de una ley. Gracias.
Gracias, Rodolfo. Gisela, no sé si quieras que le demos a Mala unos minutos para comentar.
Sí, unos minutos más y vamos cerrando porque estamos
Sí.
en hora.
Sí, estamos en hora.
Okay. That's very interesting, and thank you for sharing the experience. What interests me about this process of behind the law is that this was unanimous. It was a unanimous vote, and it also happened under, the Calderon administration, and so people question that, like, why do you have a PAN, government that was ultimately responsible for passing this law, and why was it unanimous? And I think that there were authors of the law who are known feminists, but they were very skillful in getting unanimity, because that's not so common. Nobody stood up like in favor of violence and against this law. And so I'm wondering if you have any comments, or if anybody has any comments on that nobody dared oppose it. There wasn't principled opposition.
I think that's part of the norm, right? Like, the
Right.
norm is changing, and the norm is, violence against women is wrong. That would be
Right.
one of the most important, elements of demonstrating that, there's a shift in norms. And the problem is, with time, that shift may be short-lived. We don't know. So particularly when we see that there's no state capacity to respond in some ways. Anyway, that was my last comment.
Well, I want to save the chat, and I haven't really been able to read it all, but thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a todos y todas que nos acompañan.
Gracias por sus comentarios y sus preguntas.
Sí, Mala, muchísimas gracias. Este es un trabajo muy bueno. Me encanta todo tu trabajo, ya lo sabes, entonces es muy bueno. Gisela, no sé si tú quieras decir una última
No,
parte.
thank you very much. Muchas gracias a todos. Voy a pasarle por ahí después textual las preguntas a Mala, las preguntas del chat, pero creo que se pudieron cubrir los principales puntos y muchas gracias por el interés y la participación. Y Mala, bienvenida a tu casa en Flacso, México. Es un gusto que nos apoyes siempre tanto. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Gracias. Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.